We are putting a complete siege on Gaza. No electricity, no food, no water, no gas, it's all closed. We're fighting animals and are acting accordingly.
Far-right Israeli nationalists in both parliament and the civilian population in Israel violently stormed two military facilities in protest of the arrest of 9 IDF soldiers who are accused of raping and torturing a Palestinian detainee.
להכניס מקל לרקטום של בן אדם, זה לגיטימי?
כן, אם הוא נוח'בה, הכל לגיטימי לעשות לו. הכל. הכל.
From coast to coast, anger is rising in US universities against Israel's war on Gaza.
Tonight, there are mounting fears that Israel's long-running hostilities between Iran and its allies could intensify into a wider war.
So why? Why all of this? I suspect some of us over the last few months have found ourselves asking this question. Why does this tiny little exclave on the coast of the Mediterranean matter so much to so many people? Sure, the humanitarian crisis in Gaza is unique in some ways, but that's not the whole story. One might think that the mere fact that Israel is an American ally is what puts them under so much scrutiny from the left, but it runs way deeper than that. To say that America and Israel are allies is a massive understatement. The US and Israel are not just allies. America will stick its neck out and risk its reputation for Israel more than it will for any other country. And the American political establishment is not this consistently loyal to any other ally who finds themselves in conflict this often. Geopolitically, Israel is our dog, and they could not have the power to do what they're doing now without us. And ultimately, they have to answer to us. But over the course of this war, Israel has been let entirely off its leash. And that is necessarily both our fault and our problem. This current state of affairs isn't even benefiting us, despite so many of our politicians seeming to think that it does. Israel is massively eroding America's claim to legitimacy as a global hegemon. The justification for our power, especially during the Biden presidency, has been as the protector of a rules-based world order, one which is under attack first and foremost by Russia after its invasion of Ukraine, and to a lesser extent by China for its ambitions to conquer Taiwan. This gave us a decently compelling case to defend our global hegemony. And although there are always cracks in this story, Israel put the contradictions between America's story and objective reality out in full view. Israel, a proxy for American interests in the Middle East, has blatantly disregarded the rules of war, showing at best complete indifference towards the lives of civilians, journalists, and aid workers in Gaza, none of which has been meaningfully condemned by the US. In stark contrast to that, America will not only condemn Russia for breaking international law, it will try to build its international image around upholding the rules that Russia breaks.
Great battle for freedom between a rules-based order and one governed by brute force. In this battle, we need to be clear-eyed.
But when Israel becomes the lawbreaker, nothing. No condemnation, no dramatic speeches about how the world order is under attack, and half the time American officials will even repeat whatever lies and excuses Israel comes up with.
And so Hamas and PIJ members operate a command and control node from Al-Shifa Hospital in Gaza City.
The key word here is hypocrisy. That's the defining trait of America's behavior over these last 10 months. Just blatant, unashamed hypocrisy. And that's what I want to talk about in this video. Part 2 of a 2-part series about the war in Gaza, viewed through the lens of RFK Jr. getting absolutely curb-stomped by Crystal Ball. In retrospect, I kind of feel like part 1 lacked a bit of clarity in terms of a central thread, so I want to explain what my core idea was. Basically, sitting back and watching the discourse unfold about Gaza has been an incredibly jarring and kind of alienating experience. It's been said a lot that what Israel is doing feels of a different time, and that's very true. This much open disregard for human life coming from an American ally does not feel remotely at home in the 21st century. And yet, many still try to sell this as basically just business as usual. In politics, people tend to place an emphasis on being friends with, or at the very least respecting, people who you don't agree with. But that idea really doesn't apply right now. There's something fundamentally different about disagreement when it comes to supporting what Israel is doing, as opposed to disagreement about, say, tax rates. What we're talking about here is a disagreement over the value of human life. To support what Israel is doing in Gaza is to believe that the killing of tens of thousands of Palestinians and the terrorizing of 2 million others is justified by a terror attack that killed around 1,200 Israelis. There's something about this that's just fundamentally unworthy of respect. So to see mainstream media be, by and large, on Israel's side, despite it being expected, was still a pretty jarring experience. I honestly felt like the entire world had lost either its mind or its morals. And during the middle of all this, I watched that Breaking Points interview with RFK Jr., and I saw this perfect little microcosm of the world's insanity within RFK. Someone who, quite frankly, lost his mind a long time ago, presumably to a combination of brainworms, speedballs, and whatever parasites are most common in roadkill. Basically, in this series, I'm trying to explain the absurdity of the liberal establishment's support for Israel by comparing it to RFK Jr. taking the same exact position. In this part, I'm going to focus on just how insane the discourse about this issue has been over the last few months. So, if you haven't seen part 1, go watch it now, because I'll be picking up pretty much right where I left off.
Anti-Semitism is the world's oldest hatred. For centuries, the massacre of Jews was always preceded by wild accusations. Now, just as malicious lies were leveled for centuries at the Jewish people, malicious lies are now being leveled at the Jewish state. The outrageous slanders that paint Israel as racist and genocidal are meant to delegitimize Israel, to demonize the Jewish state, and to demonize Jews everywhere.
Important caveat here, anti-Semitism has long been and continues to be a major problem in both American society and the world at large. And absolutely nothing I'm going to say here will in any way contradict this fact. At the same time, anyone who's been paying honest attention to politics over these last 10 months will clearly see that anti-Semitism is being disingenuously weaponized to shut down criticism of Zionism and genocidal Israeli policies. Honestly, I considered not even talking about anti-Semitism in this video, as doing so from a pro-Palestinian perspective almost feels like begging people to maliciously misinterpret you. But unfortunately, it's become an unavoidable topic in popular discourse about this war. It's to the point where any video about the war and America's reaction to it would feel genuinely incomplete without some discussion of anti-Semitism. I'd argue that this is, at least to some extent, the result of a deliberate propaganda strategy to whitewash Israel's genocidal war of annihilation in Gaza. But it also happens to intersect with a very real issue. The unfortunate culmination of this is that anti-Semitism is not taken seriously as a problem by many of the people who have been talking about it the loudest as it relates to this war. The shamelessness of all this is quite often not even close to subtle. For example, when pro-Palestine demonstrations were happening on college campuses in Florida, Ron DeSantis, while running for president, made a big show out of calling the protesters anti-Semitic. This was an interesting choice, considering that about a year ago, a pro-DeSantis super PAC made a campaign ad for him featuring blatant Nazi imagery, and the official DeSantis campaign account retweeted the ad. It's also pretty much common knowledge among political junkies that the DeSantis presidential campaign was absolutely full of groypers and neo-Nazis. Folks, this is your champion for the safety of the Jewish people, posing proudly in front of a black sun with a crowd of unwashed teenage neo-Nazis applauding him. In another shining example of this insincerity, Elon Musk visited Israel shortly after the October 7th attacks, even personally getting to see some of the sites Hamas attacked and getting to personally meet with their prime minister. As part of a similar PR stunt, he visited the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp, and of course had tons of media present for his tour. I mean, why else would Elon go to Auschwitz-Birkenau? Elon was applauded by many right-wing Zionists for these trips, despite the fact that he, in addition to letting open neo-Nazis run free on his platform, also regularly leaves supportive replies on blatantly anti-Semitic posts. Elon's even gone out of his way to get Nazi accounts reinstated on Twitter. And naturally, absolutely none of this behavior has changed since Elon started palling around with right-wing Zionists. These are examples of overt anti-Semitism coming from incredibly rich and powerful people. Nonetheless, if you were to ask many in the media a few months ago, it was the pro-Palestine student activists who are a threat to Jews, seemingly more so than these politicians and billionaires who associate with and promote neo-Nazis. To hardcore Zionists, anti-Semitism just doesn't count as long as that particular anti-Semite supports Israel, which is, by the way, a viewpoint Ben Shapiro practically stated outright just a few years ago. This might seem obvious to most of us, but if someone is actively associating with neo-Nazis, they probably don't actually care about Jewish people. Beyond just Ron DeSantis and Elon Musk, it's pretty common for people in the media to disingenuously invoke anti-Semitism in order to defend Israel. This becomes just painfully obvious when it comes to how the media portrayed the pro-Palestine encampments that were popping up across the country just a few months ago.
Washington University freshman Aaron Goodman says the unrest and protests on campus were very hard to avoid and frustrating for Jewish students like himself.
The past week, I've been trying to focus on exams, and I haven't been able to because of everything that's going on. I'm afraid for other people, for the other students, for my friends who are also themselves afraid.
WashU sophomore Charlie Weingarten says she feels emotionally unsafe.
Looking out on this sea of individuals with these keffiyehs and signs calling for the mass murder of Jews, whether or not they're aware of it, was like, there's not a word. If there was a word stronger than terrifying, I would use it.
This is something I have experience with personally from the encampment that was set up at my college. From what I've seen, a lot of the key organizers in this movement are themselves Jewish, and anti-Semitism does not seem to be at all a driving force behind the protest. Accusations of anti-Semitism, both implicit and explicit, were commonplace in discussions about the encampment, even coming from the university itself, I would argue. But actual anti-Semitism coming from the protest, I haven't seen credible evidence to suggest that there was any. A lot of the time, coverage of these protests insisted that the encampments were making Jewish students feel threatened. And I do believe that at least some Jewish students felt threatened in some ways by the encampment, and I genuinely feel for them. But ultimately, factually, this threat simply never materialized. I'm reminded of something a therapist told me once. Your feelings are not facts. A general tone of pro-Israel bias on the mainstream networks was absolutely dwarfed by Fox's very predictable fear-mongering. In one story they gave a lot of coverage to, a rabbi in New York emailed some Jewish college students telling them to go home for their own safety after a rise in pro-Palestine demonstrations. But why did he do this? No real reason was given, and as far as I've seen, the encampment and other pro-Palestine demonstrations have not been threatening or even hostile to Jewish people. But despite this threat being essentially hypothetical, the email from this rabbi continued to get cited on cable news for months as evidence that pro-Palestinian activism puts Jewish people in danger. The media bias on this issue has been just absurd, and I'll get more into that later. But it seems like a lot of the fears people have about pro-Palestine activism ultimately stems from media sensationalism. For a comparison here, a lot of people also feel genuinely threatened by vaccines, but that doesn't mean that this fear is backed up by an actual threat. I do also have a take that's a bit less charitable. My brutally honest opinion is that at least some of the people claiming to feel threatened by these protests are, in actuality, just Zionists who feel judged for their political beliefs, not actually threatened. If you're a Zionist who dislikes these protests, especially if you happen to be Jewish, it's pretty easy to get people to pay attention to you just by loudly insisting that the protesters are violent or anti-Semitic. For example, one woman made her way onto Piers Morgan's show by claiming she was stabbed in the eye at a pro-Palestine encampment. Anyway, here's a video of the stabbing in question. Ultimately, in part because of narratives like this, these protests didn't poll particularly well. And that's to be expected. Historically, lots of movements that are remembered very fondly today were not especially popular in their time. Back in the 60s, for example, a large majority of Americans, when polled, said that sit-ins and other protests associated with the civil rights movement were not advancing the cause of Black civil rights. Similarly, most Americans expressed disapproval of campus protests opposing the Vietnam War. False perceptions that these encampments were violent may be in part to blame for this. I usually refrain from making blanket statements like there was no significant violence coming from the pro-Palestine encampments, but as far as I can tell, that's actually true. I haven't heard any credible stories of violent attacks being perpetrated by the pro-Palestinian side, and considering that rumors of violence have largely defined coverage of these protests from the start, I feel pretty confident that if there was actual confirmed violence coming from these protesters, I would have heard about it. After all, Zionists propped up a girl who walked into a flagpole as a legitimate victim. If they had anything real to talk about, they would never stop talking about it. Also, it's worth pointing out that even if I'm wrong that no violence whatsoever came from the encampments, that still doesn't actually prove anything. Obviously, protests tend to attract extreme personalities and cultivate strong emotions among participants. So the mere fact that individual protesters were violent does not tell us anything substantial about a movement as a whole. No one, and I mean no one, genuinely, consistently believes that the presence of any violent actors within a movement automatically makes that entire movement violent. Even conservatives who will post mostly peaceful memes about BLM will themselves argue that Charlottesville, where a woman was killed, might I add, had very fine people on both sides. Violence is incredibly common during times of social unrest. So the fact that the pro-Palestine encampments had so little violence associated with them is testament to a truly exceptional commitment to nonviolence within this movement. On the other hand, Zionist counter-demonstrators have violently attacked protesters, thrown explosives into encampments, and made threatening and racist remarks to students, all while law enforcement just stood by and watched in an act of passive endorsement. The cops have also themselves been seen numerous times brutally assaulting pro-Palestine protesters. Also worth saying that the counter-protests were largely organized by and attended by non-students, including a substantial presence from overtly anti-Semitic far-right groups. All of this went largely ignored by the media, and some of the racist thugs who demonstrated on behalf of Israel even got a direct shout-out from Netanyahu himself. It's also worth pointing out that no one in the media feigning concern about Jewish student safety even pretended to care when Jewish protesters in the encampments were brutally attacked by the cops. In one incident at Northwestern University, a Zionist agitator, in a truly cartoonish attempt to smear the pro-Palestine activists, shouted, "Kill the Jews, who's with me?" and was, of course, met with immediate disapproval from the protesters. Nonetheless, this was later cited by the university as a justification to have police tear down the encampment and arrest the protesters. By and large, the media has presented a narrative wherein the encampments are threatening violence against Jewish students, while counter-protesters usually get little to no blame for violence that they, in reality, are directly responsible for. And despite no real evidence for the media's narrative, it was still absolutely the dominant portrayal of these protests in mainstream media. In one case, a headline from the LA Times that accurately described counter-protesters attacking an encampment was edited after its publishing to be made less accurate and to obscure the basic facts of the story.
Even the LA Times actually said, UCLA cancels classes after counter-protesters violently attack pro-Palestinian camp. Wait, check out the LA Times headline now, much more ambiguous. No. Dude, are you serious?
Quite honestly, the crackdown on and smearing of these protests has been one of the most overtly fascistic events I've seen play out in America in quite a while, which is saying something. All of this, by the way, is happening under and being endorsed by a Democratic president. It's hard to overstate the extent to which media coverage of the encampments has shown us the complete opposite of the truth. Instead of raging anti-Semitism, most encampments across the country included Shabbat dinners, kosher meals, and scheduled Jewish prayers. I know the one at my school did. Unfortunately, there are still quite a lot of places around the world, and even in America, where Jews face a substantial risk of violence and persecution from the people around them. But pro-Palestine demonstrations on college campuses, based on all available evidence, simply do not seem to be one of those places. Even before these encampments, bullshit narratives have dominated the media's coverage of Israel's genocidal assault on Gaza and of the world's response to it. But when you look past the propaganda, it's clear that Israeli society is going down a very dark road. Returning to the comparison from the last video, we can see that Israel's invocation of anti-Semitism has essentially thrown gas on the fire of their people's post-terrorism insanity. By presenting all opposition to Israel's genocide as anti-Semitism, the Israeli leadership can play on their population's generational trauma to rally them into supporting the war effort. This clearly has worked in getting Israelis to support the war, as even when Israelis protest for ceasefires, they do so because they want their own hostages back, not because they think their genocide is going too far, because overwhelmingly, they do not think it's going too far. Also, rhetorical appeals to anti-Semitism can be effective in silencing criticism, at least for some critical allies, allowing Israel to continue spiraling into their genocidal fervor unhindered. This is not indicative of good things to come for either Palestinians or Israelis. Regarding post-terrorism insanity, I would argue that Israel's reaction to the 7th was even more excessive than America's reaction to 9/11. And our reaction to 9/11 was absolutely wild in its own right. In the early 2000s, almost no condemnation of terrorists was considered too extreme, and any nuance that could be seen as sympathizing with the enemy came with a hefty social consequence. Famously, despite all the supposed left-wing bias in Hollywood, Michael Moore literally got booed at the Oscars for bad-mouthing George Bush in the Iraq War.
We live in a time where we have a man sending us to war for fictitious reasons, whether it's the fictition of duct tape or the fictitious of orange alerts. We are against this war, Mr. Bush. Shame on you, Mr. Bush.
And this is the absolute least of our insanity in the early 2000s. Islamophobia went through the roof and became totally normalized. Americans demanded blood in the Middle East as payback for the Twin Towers. Every country song made for the next 15 years became jingoistic, America-branded word salad. 'Cause we'll put a boot in your ass, it's an American way. We even started calling them freedom fries because France wouldn't invade Iraq with us. As long as I live, I don't think I'll ever process that that isn't just bad satire. But in spite of all that, and with very few exceptions, people didn't really say that Al-Qaeda was literally as bad as the Nazis. In stark contrast to that, Israel's defenders will regularly say that Hamas is as bad as, or sometimes even straight up worse than, the Nazis. Or if they're feeling a bit more tame, they'll say ISIS instead. But in either case, they treat these groups as simple rhetorical shorthands for evil and not as real organizations. Although Hamas certainly has some pretty significant crimes under its belt, the reality of Hamas is far insufficient for Zionists. They have to go above and beyond to paint Hamas as absurdly, almost cartoonishly evil. After the 7th, especially on Twitter, it was common to see posts with thousands of likes declaring that Hamas is the same as, or at least morally equivalent to, ISIS. A trending hashtag used by official Israeli Twitter accounts was Hamas is ISIS. This is despite the fact that Hamas and ISIS are very different groups with mutually exclusive goals and ideologies. And because of that, Hamas has fought numerous battles against ISIS-backed proxies in Gaza, and ISIS went as far as to declare war on Hamas back in 2018. But yeah, sure, Hamas is ISIS. Why not? This line is ridiculous and quite frankly racist. Israel knows that Americans, and yes, this propaganda line is made specifically for us, by and large won't know or care about the differences between Hamas and ISIS. Americans will just see them both as scary Arab terrorists and be immediately ready to accept that they're basically the same thing. Israel's defenders don't see Hamas or ISIS as real groups of people with motivations. Instead, they talk about them the way that hardcore Christians talk about the devil. The devil doesn't get described as having motives or goals or an ideology. He's just kind of evil because he is. Israel's defenders see these aforementioned groups in exactly the same way. This reduces all of these groups to buzzwords that are more or less interchangeable with each other and with any other group the speaker considers bad. Hamas is ISIS, Hamas is just like the Nazis, the UN is Hamas, South Africa is Hamas, etc., etc., etc. This is part of a delusion I'd like to dub the axis of evil fallacy, a cognitive distortion where one sees their various fractured geopolitical opponents as part of a unified front that is threatening them. In the lead up to the Iraq War, then President George Bush referred to Iran, Iraq, and North Korea as being part of a so-called axis of evil. Over here in reality, where most Americans would never find it, is the fact that Iran and Iraq are rivals that have literally gone to war in the recent past, and North Korea has very little to do with either of them. The only real thing uniting this supposed axis is its hostility towards the US. But shared opposition towards one particular declining power is not the same thing as an alliance, let alone an axis of evil. Israel, just like us in the early 2000s, is trying to convince their allies that everyone who opposes them is actually a unified evil bloc that stands in solidarity with Hamas. This gets to the point where even American student protesters are smeared as being Hamas sympathizers, anti-Semites, or funded by Iran. Beyond that, a kind of us versus them, morally black and white way of thinking seems to be commonplace in Israel, perhaps best represented by Benjamin Netanyahu's tweet declaring this war to be, quote, a battle between the children of light and the children of darkness, between humanity and the law of the jungle. Beyond that, tons of people in Israel, everyone from Israeli soldiers to important members of the Knesset, have said unambiguously that they do not believe there are any innocent people in Gaza. Something unique about Gaza is that its population is quite young, meaning that a disproportionate amount of Gazans are infants and children. So based on this logic that there is simply no innocents there, infants and children would be viewed essentially as enemy combatants, which could explain why IDF soldiers shoot children so suspiciously often. This mindset is part of the reason why the war in Gaza has been so deadly for children in particular. More kids have died in Gaza in 6 months than have been recorded dead in every other conflict zone in the world combined over the last 2 years. It's statistics like these, by the way, that I'd recommend you keep in mind the next time someone smugly tries to tell you that there's no genocide in Gaza. None of this, unfortunately, makes a difference for committed Zionists, who simply believe that Israel is an essentially good and liberal country. This is why liberal Zionists deflect from the obvious rising tide of fascism in Israeli society by saying that it's just the leadership or the people don't support Netanyahu. This is less a statement about the political realities in Israel and more an expression of the speaker's deeply held assumption that Israel is a fundamentally liberal country, and therefore any illiberal behavior they exhibit is just a temporary aberration, a transient problem with the leadership, and certainly not any kind of reflection of the deeper nature of Zionism. In spite of its sheer unreality, or maybe even because of it, Israeli propaganda has managed to catch hold in mainstream discourse. Even in respected publications, insane equivalencies between Hamas and the Nazis are tolerated. One article published in the Times of Israel said that the Holocaust's threat of annihilation was echoed in a list of events that included the First Intifada. This is absolutely batshit insane, and frankly, I would call it Holocaust denial. The First Intifada consisted largely of civil disobedience, and when it did become violent, it targeted the Israeli military. By the end of it, Palestinian deaths outnumbered Israeli deaths almost 10-1 due to massacres committed by the IDF. This is compared by the Times of Israel, an allegedly serious publication, to the threat Jews faced during the Holocaust, wherein an entire state industry of mass murder killed 6 million innocent Jews, men, women, and children alike. Frankly, I'm kind of at a loss for words. Israel, with all the honesty of a traveling snake oil salesman, constantly tries to sell Hamas as the new Nazis. This comparison will never not be incredibly strained. Israel, the self-proclaimed Jewish state, is violently occupying Gaza as well as all of Palestine, both the nation and the historic region. The Jewish people living in Europe in the 1930s and 40s were not, in any sense of the word, occupiers. For this reason, and this reason alone, Hamas, or any other Palestinian militant group, is deeply and profoundly not the same as the Nazis. This remains true no matter how horrific any war crimes they commit are, and no matter how hateful their movement is or will become. This is, obviously, not to excuse anything Hamas does or believes. This is simply stating that there is a fundamental moral difference between violence from an occupied people against the population of the occupying state and violence from a dominant group within a country against a persecuted minority within that same country. And this remains true even if that violence is purely destructive and wholly unjustifiable. The fact that Palestinians were and are occupied fundamentally changes the ethics of this conflict in a way that Zionists cannot honestly contend with. Nonetheless, Israel still insists on their Nazi comparisons. And since much of the Israeli government is unconvinced that there are innocent civilians in Gaza at all, this characterization of Hamas gets broadly applied to the entire Gazan population. Pretty soon, it becomes inadequate to say that Hamas is just like the Nazis. You have to say all the people of Gaza are just like the Nazis too. In a Twitter video posted by the IDF, a brand new, pristine copy of Mein Kampf was allegedly found in the war-torn bedroom of a Gazan child. And yes, the post said specifically it was in a child's bedroom. So it's pretty ironic that this video exists right alongside countless posts from the IDF insisting that they're doing everything they can to protect civilians, children in particular. If that was actually true, why would they feel the need to implicitly justify the killing of Gazan kids like they're blatantly doing here? Another IDF propaganda video showed an iPad that was again found by the Israeli army in a civilian house in Gaza. The soldier then turns on the iPad, revealing the home screen to be, and I'm not even joking here, Adolf Hitler. If you had told me this story a year ago, I would have brushed it off as bad satire. So what's the point of this? It's to portray regular people in Gaza, even children, as a genocidal threat to Jewish people everywhere. That way, when you wipe out a civilian population, you can portray it as preventing a genocide to obscure the fact that you're committing one yourself. The point of this tactic is to create a simple moral binary. Israel is good, and Hamas, and by extension Gaza as a whole, is bad. Hence the insistence among Zionists that the civilian population supports Hamas. This propaganda is some of the fakest shit I've ever seen in my life. This might be a controversial take, but I honestly think Russia's propaganda ahead of their full-scale invasion of Ukraine was way more believable than this shit. Ahead of the attack, Russian state media released footage of staged terror attacks allegedly perpetrated by Ukrainian troops. And although the videos were pretty sloppily made and provably fake, it still took at least some expertise to identify the giveaways. I'm not much of a military guy, so when these videos came out, I had to have it explained to me how it was known that they were fake. But with Israel, almost none of their propaganda passes even the most basic vibe check. Whenever the IDF makes some bold statement, you can usually just assume they're lying and reliably be proven right within a couple of weeks. And if you don't believe me, the world is still waiting on any proof whatsoever of a Hamas command and control center under Al-Shifa Hospital. So there's really no elegant way to do this, but this video is going to have to come to an abrupt end. Basically, I found out way too late that the editor I use has a hard limit on the number of audio files I can put in one project. And this paragraph here is going to bring me up to that limit. I definitely understand that this is not the best way to end a video. I mean, you can probably tell I was right in the middle of my train of thought. But with the technical abilities I have now, this was unfortunately my best option. I'll try to have a part 2 up as soon as I can, and it's basically just going to be a continuation of this video. I feel like given the circumstances, I should end on some big sweeping insight to conclude this piece. And so here that is. The effects of wars are not purely limited to the regions they take place in. Wars, or in this case genocides, are significant enough for them to create ripple effects that cross the world many times over. When it comes to this war in particular, a political battle in the US, a culture war, to use a particularly stupid phrase, has exploded in reaction to Israel's genocide. And I would posit that for you as an American watching all this play out, the conflict around this conflict is most fundamentally about your willingness to accept and justify the mass killing of Arabs and Muslims. America has never really gotten past its hatred of Muslims that took over after 9/11. And the residual effects of that are being felt in the intense support for Israel that much of American society has shown over the last year. October 7th, the Nakba, the Balfour Declaration, the 6 Days War, the Sabra and Shatila Massacre, and any other notable events related to Palestine are all certainly good to understand. But for us as Americans, that history is not what this conflict is principally about. Americans don't know about the specifics of foreign policy. They form their beliefs based on whichever narrative most appeals to them. And the narratives that support Israel are ones that dehumanize Palestinians and Arabs in general at every available opportunity. These narratives are, as I've been talking about, completely mainstream in our culture. And they remain popular because we, as a country, have never left the Islamophobic hysteria that exploded after 9/11. And that's why so many people feel threatened by any kind of rhetoric that supports Palestine. Because this country has, at a deep level, internalized the notion that Arabs are not human beings like the rest of us. The only way that America could bring peace to Palestine is if this reality finally changes.